He was on his knees when the gun touched his temple. Marble floor, cold, pristine. Blood slid slowly down his forehead, dripping onto stone that had never known mercy. Last chance. The man behind him said, "Do you regret answering that call?" The question wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Power never raises its voice. He laughed softly, breath uneven, eyes burning, not with fear, but with memory. "No," he said. "I regret not letting her run sooner." Footsteps echoed. A woman's voice broke through the silence, shaking, desperate. "Stop," for the first time. He closed his eyes, because if this was the end, he wanted to remember her alive, not standing between him and a bullet, not paying the price for a mistake that began at 2:37 a.m., cut to black. 7 days earlier, her phone rang. The phone rang in the middle of the rain-soaked night. Ellie woke with a sharp intake of breath, her hand reaching instinctively toward the sound before her mind fully caught up. The apartment was dark, wrapped in the muted hush that came just before dawn, when the world felt suspended between forgetting and remembering. The glow from her phone sliced through the darkness, a pale blue line across the ceiling. 2:37 a.m. blinked on the screen. Steady and unforgiving, she hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" Her voice came out rough, still tangled with sleep. Silence followed, not the harmless kind, but the heavy, listening kind, as if someone on the other end was deciding whether she was worth speaking to. Then she heard it, a low, controlled breath, slow and deliberate. "Where are you?" The words did not rise at the end. There was no question in them. They landed like an order. Ellie pushed herself upright, the thin blanket sliding to her waist. "I think you have the wrong number," she said, forcing calm into her tone. "Who are you calling?" Another pause, this one longer. "Don't play games with me." A chill crept up her spine. "I'm a nurse," she said quickly, as if explaining herself might somehow anchor the situation to logic. "I just got off a night shift. If you don't tell me who you are, you're not the person I'm looking for." The man interrupted. His voice slowed, darkened. "But you answered." The way he said answered made her fingers tighten around the phone. Ellie hung up. She stared at the blank screen, heart pounding, telling herself she was overreacting. Wrong numbers happened. People called in the middle of the night all the time. She lay back down, closed her eyes, and tried to breathe through the unease settling in her chest. 3 minutes later, the phone vibrated again. Same number. She didn't answer. Instead, a message appeared. "If you're not the one I'm looking for, you're safe." Her breath caught. She read it twice, then a third time. Her eyes snagging on one word, safe. From what her apartment suddenly felt smaller. The familiar hum of the refrigerator sounded too loud, the rain against the windows too deliberate. Ellie locked the screen and set the phone face down, as if that might stop whatever had already begun. She didn't sleep again. Morning came in fragments. Coffee she didn't taste, a shower that failed to wash away the lingering tension. By the time she reached the hospital, she had almost convinced herself it was nothing more than a strange coincidence, a late-night call, an unnerving voice, a badly worded message. Then the flowers arrived. They were waiting at the nurse's station, wrapped in dark paper, the petals a deep, unsettling red, not cheerful, not celebratory, intentional. The card bore her name in neat, precise lettering, Ellie Morgan, no sender, no explanation, just a narrow strip of paper tucked between the roses. There are no wrong calls. Her hands trembled as she read it. Around her, the hospital moved on as it always did, phones ringing, carts rolling, voices overlapping, but for Ellie, the world narrowed to that single sentence. Her supervisor asked if everything was all right. Ellie nodded, because it was easier than explaining a fear she couldn't name. She took the flowers to the break room and left them there, untouched. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. Patience blurred together. Routine tasks performed on muscle memory alone. Every time her phone buzzed, her pulse spiked. It never rang again. But the silence felt intentional now. Like a pause before something inevitable. When her shift finally ended, the sky outside had darkened once more. Rain clung to the pavement. reflecting the city lights in fractured streaks. Ellie wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she stepped into the parking lot. She didn't see him at first. He stood across the street, partially hidden by shadow, posture relaxed yet unmistakably alert. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't checking his phone. He was watching the hospital entrance with quiet focus, as if he had been there for some time. Ellie slowed, her instincts flaring. The distance between them was too far to see his face clearly, but she felt the weight of his attention the moment his gaze shifted to her. It was not predatory. It was not rushed. It was certain. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A single message appeared. "Don't walk home alone tonight." Ellie stopped. Across the street, the man straightened just slightly. The movement was subtle, controlled. He didn't cross toward her. He didn't wave. He simply met her eyes, even from that distance, and inclined his head in acknowledgement, as if confirming what she had already begun to understand. This wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Ellie stood frozen for a long moment before turning back toward the hospital doors, her heart racing. She didn't know who he was or what he wanted, only that a single answered call had quietly rearranged the boundaries of her life. And somewhere in the rain-soaked dark, a man who never made mistakes had finally found the wrong number that mattered. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. End of part 1. The hospital parking lot lay under a tired wash of yellow lights, their glow softened by the thin mist drifting in from the rain-soaked streets. Ellie stepped outside with her coat pulled tight around her, the strap of her bag cutting into her shoulder, her mind still replaying the message she had received minutes earlier. Don't walk home alone tonight. She told herself it was coincidence. That fear had sharpened her imagination. Yet, the unease refused to loosen its grip. She saw him immediately. He stood beside a black car parked where the light barely touched, tall and still, as if the night had shaped itself around him. His suit was dark, impeccably fitted, not a wrinkle out of place despite the damp air. He wasn't scanning the lot, wasn't pretending to be occupied. His gaze was already on her, steady and unhurried, as though her arrival had been expected down to the second. Ellie Morgan. Her name. Spoken aloud by a stranger. Struck like a hand closing around her heart, she stopped short. Who are you? Her fingers slid into her pocket, curling tightly around the canister of pepper spray she carried more out of habit than belief. She had never needed it before. Tonight. It felt absurdly small. The man took one step toward her, then stopped, respecting a distance that felt deliberate rather than cautious. Up close, she caught the faint scent of wood and spice, restrained, expensive, and unsettlingly calm. There was nothing hurried about him, nothing uncertain. Everything about his presence suggested control. Alejandro Russo. The name moved through the air like a ripple. A security guard nearby, halfway to his car, froze for a fraction of a second before turning away, suddenly interested in anything but the exchange unfolding a few meters from him. Ellie swallowed. You've been following me. I've been looking for you, and that's the same thing. Alejandro's mouth curved, not quite a smile. His eyes, dark and unreadable, lingered on her face as though committing every detail to memory. If I were following you, he said calmly, you wouldn't be standing here alone. The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, delivered without emotion, which somehow made them more disturbing. He reached into his jacket and placed a card on the hood of the car between them. The sound was soft, deliberate. An offering rather than a demand. Don't go home alone for the next few days. Ellie stared at the card, then back at him. You don't get to tell me what to do. His gaze sharpened, the warmth draining from it. I do. The certainty in his voice sent a shiver through her, and I'm using that right. He continued, lowering his tone. To keep you alive. Anger flared, instinctively chasing fear. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. His eyes flicked briefly to the hospital entrance, then back to her. You work nights. You live alone. You answer your phone when it rings at 2:37 in the morning. Her breath hitched before she could stop it. I also know, he added, almost gently, that someone else was meant to answer that call. Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears. What do you want from me? For now, Alejandro said. Nothing. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. People like you don't show up uninvited to say nothing. People like me, he replied. Unoffended, don't wait for invitations. And the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Cars came and went at the edges of the lot, their engines and headlights briefly intruding before disappearing again. No one looked their way, or perhaps they chose not to. Alejandro turned slightly. As if preparing to leave, go back inside, he said. Call a ride. I'll make sure you get home. I didn't ask you to. I know. Something in the way he said it unsettled her more than if he had argued. Ellie watched him open the car door, his movements smooth, unhurried, as though the outcome of this encounter had never been in doubt. Before he got in, he looked at her once more. From now on, he said, his voice low, measured. You're my responsibility. The phrase settled over her like a sentence. He drove away. The black car melting into the night with barely a sound. Ellie remained where she was, the parking lot suddenly feeling far too exposed. Slowly, she reached for the card he had left behind. Alejandro Russo, a phone number, no title, no address. She turned it over. Her stomach dropped. Printed neatly on the back was her home address, complete down to the apartment number. Ellie closed her fingers around the card, her hand trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. This was no longer a coincidence, no longer a strange encounter she could explain away tomorrow. The man hadn't asked for permission because he hadn't needed it. He had already stepped into her life, already drawn lines she had never agreed to, but somehow felt bound by. She went back inside the hospital and waited for a ride, her gaze drawn again and again to the dark stretch of road beyond the glass doors. Somewhere out there, Alejandro Russo was moving through the city with quiet authority, rearranging pieces she hadn't known were part of a larger game. Ellie didn't yet understand what role she played in it, only that the moment he had spoken her name, something irreversible had begun. 3 days passed in a silence that felt carefully staged. Nothing happened. No calls, no messages, no flowers. The city went on breathing around Ellie as if nothing had shifted, as if her life had not tilted off its familiar axis the moment a stranger spoke her name in a parking lot. She returned to work, tended to patients, smiled when required, answered questions with the right tone. On the surface, she was functional. Inside, every quiet moment stretched too long, like the pause before bad news. She slept with her phone on the pillow beside her. On the 4th night, it rang. Ellie woke instantly, heart already racing, as though some part of her had been waiting for the sound. The number on the screen did not surprise her. Alejandro, she said before he could speak. The man I was looking for that night, he said, his voice low and controlled, is dead. She pushed herself upright in bed, the sheet slipping to her waist. What are you talking about? He was pulled from the river an hour ago. Alejandro continued. No phone, no wallet, no identification. Ellie's fingers tightened around the edge of the mattress. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the last number he called. The words settled heavily between them. Her throat went dry. You mean, before he died? Yes. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick and resistant. Ellie swung her legs off the bed, pressing her bare feet to the floor as if grounding herself might stop the world from spinning. What does that have to do with me? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer. It matters, Alejandro said, because his phone number differs from yours by 1 digit. Ellie closed her eyes. 1 number. 1 insignificant mistake. A slip of the finger in the dark. He was trying to reach someone else. She whispered, and reached you instead. The silence that followed was sharp, cutting. Ellie swallowed, her pulse loud in her ears. So he called me. Then what? You think I set him up, that I lured him somewhere? No. The word came quickly, firmly. Then what do you think? Her voice trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. Alejandro paused. She imagined him standing still somewhere, eyes distant, assembling the pieces of a puzzle she could barely see. I think, he said at last, that you were meant to be a test for whoever was watching him. Her stomach dropped. You said I was safe. You were, he replied, until you answered again. Ellie let out a brittle laugh that sounded wrong even to her own ears. So what am I now, a witness, an accomplice? No. His voice softened, just slightly. Bait. The word struck harder than she expected. Bait was disposable. Bait was used and forgotten. You talk about this like it's a game, she said, anger flaring to cover the fear. A man is dead. I know, Alejandro said quietly. That's why I'm calling. She wanted to ask how he knew so much, how deep this went, how many lives were tangled in whatever world he inhabited. Instead, she asked the only question that mattered. What happens to me? Another pause. Then, that depends on whether you listen to me, and the call ended before she could respond. Ellie sat there for a long time, the phone still pressed to her ear. Staring at the faint reflection of herself in the darkened window, she looked the same, tired eyes, loose hair, a woman who should have been worrying about her next shift. Not about dead men and rivers and numbers that didn't quite line up. She told herself she would be fine. That Alejandro's warnings were exaggerated, colored by a world she did not belong to. When she finally lay back down, sleep came in thin, restless fragments. She woke to the sound of her front door. Ellie froze, heart slamming against her ribs. The apartment was dark, silent except for the soft creak of wood. She held her breath, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the echo of something having been disturbed. Slowly, she slid out of bed and crossed the hallway. Every nerve stretched tight. The living room came into view, and with it, the front door slightly ajar. The lock hung crooked, splintered where it had been forced. Someone had been inside. Ellie's gaze moved instinctively to the kitchen. The overhead light was on. On the dining table lay a single sheet of paper. She approached it as though it might bite. We know who you are. No signature. No explanation. Her hands shook as she backed away. The reality of Alejandro's words crashing down on her all at once. This was not intimidation for its own sake. This was confirmation. Someone had come looking for a man who no longer existed and had found her instead. Ellie grabbed her phone and dialed without thinking. Alejandro answered on the first ring. I'm not arguing, she said. Her voice unsteady but resolute. I'm not telling you to stay away. Someone broke into my apartment. I know, he replied. The calm in his voice should have reassured her. Instead, it made her knees weak. Yes. Then you knew this would happen. I knew it was possible. Ellie closed her eyes, fighting the urge to cry. I don't want to be brave, she said softly. I just want to be safe. You will be, Alejandro said. But not there. She pressed her forehead to the wall, the cool surface grounding her. I didn't choose this. No, he agreed. But it chose you. She let out a slow breath. For the first time since that night at 2:37 a.m., she didn't protest. She didn't ask him to leave her alone or accuse him of crossing lines. The fear had stripped those defenses away, leaving only clarity. Tell me what to do, Ellie said. There it was, and the shift she had been resisting. Alejandro did not sound triumphant. If anything, his voice was grave. Pack only what you need. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hesitated. And after that, he said, you don't walk into rooms alone anymore. Ellie hung up and stood in the middle of her apartment, surrounded by the life she had built in quiet, careful pieces somewhere in the city. A man lay dead because he had reached for the wrong number in the dark, somewhere else. Men who did not knock were searching for answers she did not have. And between those two truths stood her phone, still warm in her hand, and the certainty that the silence of the past 3 days had only been the calm before something far more dangerous began. The Russo estate stood far from the city, isolated by long stretches of road and iron gates that closed behind them with a final, echoing wait. The silence there was different from the quiet of Ellie's apartment. It wasn't empty, it was controlled, deliberate, as if sound itself had been trained to behave. Ellie stepped out of the car slowly, her senses sharpening as she took in her surroundings. The villa rose from the darkness like something carved rather than built stone walls. Tall windows, lights glowing faintly from within. There were no visible guards, no obvious security, yet she felt watched from every angle. Alejandro noticed her hesitation but didn't rush her. He simply waited one hand resting lightly on the car door, his presence steady rather than forceful. Inside, the air was cool and faintly scented with wood and old paper. The villa did not feel like a home. It felt like a headquarters. Ellie followed Alejandro down a long corridor until they reached a room tucked away from the rest of the house, his study, and the door closed behind them with a muted click. A single lamp illuminated the desk at the center of the room. On its polished surface lay a thick folder, its edges worn as if it had been opened many times. Alejandro gestured toward it. "Look." Ellie approached slowly, every instinct warning her that once she touched what lay inside, there would be no turning back. Her fingers brushed the cover, and she opened it. The first page stole her breath. Her parents stared back at her from a photograph taken decades earlier. They were younger than she remembered, their smiles caught mid-laughter. The corner of the image blackened and curled as if scorched by fire. Ellie's chest tightened. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Those photos were destroyed." Alejandro leaned against the edge of the desk. His arms folded loosely, and the fire wasn't meant to erase memories. He said, "It was meant to erase evidence." Ellie shook her head, denial rising like a reflex. "You're lying. The police said it was an electrical fault. The police were given a version they could live with." His voice was calm, almost gentle. The truth was more inconvenient. She flipped through the pages with trembling hands. Documents, reports, names she didn't recognize, dates that aligned too perfectly with moments she had spent years trying to forget. Her father's name appeared again and again, woven through transactions and meetings that had nothing to do with the modest life she remembered. "My father was a teacher," she said, the words sounding thin even to herself. "He was also a consultant." Alejandro replied. "For people who paid well to stay invisible." Ellie looked up at him sharply. "You expect me to believe this? I expect you to read it." He said, "Belief comes later." Her gaze dropped back to the file. A memory stirred late nights, whispered phone calls, her mother's strained smile when Ellie asked questions, things she had dismissed as adult worries, unworthy of a child's concern. Now they rearranged themselves into something far darker. "This doesn't explain the fire," Ellie said quietly, "or why they died." Alejandro reached into a drawer and set something on the desk between them. Metal glinted under the lamp. Ellie's breath caught. "That's impossible." The locket lay there, its surface dulled by age but unmistakable. She had worn it every day until the night of the fire, when it vanished along with everything else she owned. "I lost it," she said, her voice barely audible. "No," Alejandro corrected. "It was taken." Ellie picked it up with shaking fingers, and the metal was cool against her skin, grounding and unreal all at once, turning it over. She noticed the faint engraving on the back, a string of numbers she had never seen before. "What is this?" she asked. "A key," Alejandro said, "or part of one." She looked at him, confusion and anger tangling in her chest. "You've had this the whole time." "I've known about it," he said carefully. "I didn't have it until recently." Ellie studied his face, searching for cracks, for signs of manipulation. Instead, she found something else: restraint. He was not pressing her, not demanding answers or loyalty. He had placed the truth in front of her and stepped back. "You brought me here to trap me," she said. "No." His gaze held her steadily. "I brought you here to give you a choice." She laughed softly, bitterly. "What choice to stay," Alejandro said, "and hear everything, or to leave now, knowing only enough to be afraid." The words settled heavily between them. Ellie closed the folder, her fingers lingering on the cover. Her mind raced, struggling to reconcile the man standing before her with the world he represented. He was dangerous. That much was undeniable. Yet he had not touched her, not cornered her, not raised his voice. Everything about his control lay in what he did not do. "If I stay," she asked slowly. "What happens to me?" Alejandro considered her question. "You become involved," he said honestly. "You learn things you can't unlearn, and you stop being invisible. And if I leave, then you go back to your apartment." He said, "And whoever came looking for you will come again." without knocking. Ellie felt the weight of the locket in her palm, the past pressing against the present. She met his eyes, searching for dominance, for expectation. Instead, she found patience. He was waiting. Not because he doubted the outcome, but because he respected the decision itself. "You're not forcing me," she said. "No," Alejandro replied. "I don't need to." A strange calm settled over her, threaded with fear and something else she didn't yet want to name. She realized that this man, who moved through power like a second skin, had deliberately placed that power aside. He was letting her walk away if she chose to. Ellie drew a slow breath. "Tell me everything," she said. Alejandro inclined his head, the gesture subtle, almost reverent. "Then sit," he said. "And don't look away." As she lowered herself into the chair across from him, the walls of the villa seemed to close in, sealing her inside a truth that had been waiting for her all along, outside. The night remained still, indifferent to the moment unfolding within stone walls and quiet promises. Ellie didn't know it yet, but by choosing to stay, she had crossed a threshold more dangerous than any locked door. And Alejandro Russo, for the first time in years, allowed himself to wonder what it would cost him to keep her safe once she knew everything. "Stay here," Alejandro said, "until this is over." The words were calm, measured, spoken as if they were the most reasonable solution in the world. Ellie stood in the doorway of the study. The villa's quiet pressing in around her, the locket still heavy in her pocket. "No," she replied. The refusal surprised even herself. It came from somewhere stubborn and instinctive, a place that recoiled at the idea of being contained, no matter how gilded the cage. "You don't get to decide where I live." Alejandro studied her for a long moment. There was no irritation in his expression, no anger, only calculation and something that looked dangerously close to concern. "I get to decide whether you live," he said quietly. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It's worse." Ellie left before the silence between them could harden into something binding. She drove back to her apartment with her hands clenched tight on the steering wheel, repeating the same thought like a prayer, "I can still choose." The city lights blurred past her, familiar streets offering a false sense of normalcy. She ignored the voice in her head that told her Alejandro hadn't argued because he didn't need to. The apartment greeted her with stillness. Ellie moved through the rooms carefully, checking corners, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Everything looked as she had left it. The door was locked. The windows were intact. She exhaled, letting tension seep from her shoulders, and told herself she was letting fear dictate her reactions. She went to bed fully dressed, sometime after midnight. A sound pulled her from sleep, not loud, not abrupt, just wrong. Ellie sat up, heart pounding, straining to identify it. A soft scrape, the muted click of metal against wood. Her breath caught as she realized it was coming from the front door. She didn't scream. Instinct took over. Sharp and cold, she reached for her phone, fingers shaking but froze when she heard voices low, urgent, unfamiliar, and the door opened. Ellie slid from the bed and backed into the hallway, her pulse roaring in her ears. She thought of Alejandro's words, of the certainty in his gaze, of the choice she had insisted on making. "I can still choose." The thought felt hollow now. A crash shattered the silence. Ellie covered her mouth, tears blurring her vision. There was shouting, a brief struggle, a sound like something heavy hitting the floor. Then nothing. The quiet that followed was worse. She didn't know how long she stood there, unmoving, until she heard footsteps retreating, the door slamming shut. Her legs finally gave out, and she sank to the floor, sobs tearing free despite her effort to stay silent. When she reached the living room, she saw the body. A man lay sprawled near the table, blood spreading slowly beneath him, staining the carpet in dark, irreversible patterns. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Ellie stumbled back, nausea rising sharply. Her phone slipped from her fingers as she dialed without thinking. Alejandro answered before the second ring. "There's someone here," she whispered, her voice breaking. He's He's dead. I know, Alejandro said. The calm in his voice cut through her panic like a blade. You knew this would happen. Yes, I told you to stay. Ellie slid down against the wall, tears streaming freely now. I didn't think I know, he repeated, softer this time. Listen to me. Don't touch anything. I'm on my way. He arrived before the sirens. The sound of police in the distance barely registered before Alejandro was there, his presence filling the apartment with a different kind of gravity. He took in the scene with a glance, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Without a word, he crossed to Ellie and crouched in front of her. Can you stand? He asked. She nodded numbly. He helped her to her feet, his hand firm at her elbow, grounding her even as her legs trembled beneath her. He wrapped a coat around her shoulders. She didn't remember him picking it up and guided her out the back stairwell just as flashing lights painted the walls blue and red. The car ride was silent. The city passed by in streaks of color and shadow, the rain beginning again, soft and relentless. Ellie stared out the window, her chest tight, breaths shallow. Her hands shook in her lap, slick with sweat. Then the tears came. They weren't loud. There was no sound at all, just the quiet, unstoppable spill of grief and shock and fear she had been holding back for days. Alejandro noticed immediately. He slowed the car, then pulled over to the side of the road. He turned toward her. Look at me. The words were gentle, but they carried weight. Ellie lifted her head, eyes swollen and unfocused. In the dim light of the dashboard, Alejandro looked different, less polished, more human. There were shadows beneath his eyes, tension etched into the lines of his face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't listen. His hand reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before his fingers closed lightly around her wrist, and the touch was warm, steady. It anchored her. I'm not keeping you because I want to, he said quietly. I'm keeping you because if I don't, I will lose you. The words settled over her like true stripped bare of pretense. Ellie searched his face, seeing exhaustion where she had expected arrogance, restraint where she had feared control. You can't protect everyone, she said. No, Alejandro agreed, but I can protect you. Something shifted between them in that moment. The space that had been filled with defiance softened, reshaped by necessity and something more fragile. Ellie realized, with a startling clarity, that Alejandro Russo was not untouchable. His power had limits. His certainty came at a cost, and somehow that made him more dangerous and more real. She leaned back against the seat, the fight draining out of her. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere safe, he replied. For how long, he didn't answer immediately. His gaze returned to the road, his jaw tightening. Until this ends, he said at last. Ellie closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. She thought of her apartment, of the life she had insisted on holding on to, now irrevocably marked by blood and fear. She thought of the man beside her, who had offered protection without asking for permission and had paid for her refusal with someone else's life. When she opened her eyes again, she spoke softly, the words tasting like surrender and resolve all at once. Next time, she said, I won't run. Alejandro glanced at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He simply drove on, carrying them both deeper into a night where protection was no longer a promise, it was a debt. And they had only just begun to understand its price. And the first gunshot tore through the night like a scream. Ellie jolted awake, her heart slamming violently against her ribs before her mind could catch up. For a split second, the villa was silent again, deceptively calm, as though the sound had been imagined. Then came the second shot, closer this time, followed by the sharp shatter of glass. Alejandro was already on his feet. Stay behind me, he said, his voice low and steady, as if chaos had not just announced itself at their door. Ellie barely had time to swing her legs off the bed before he reached her, one hand firm at her back, guiding her into the corridor. The villa that had felt impenetrable hours earlier now seemed exposed, every shadow a potential threat. Alarms remained silent. Alejandro had designed it that way. She realized dimly, silence meant control. Another shot echoed, closer still. They're inside, Ellie whispered. Yes, Alejandro replied. No surprise, no panic, and they moved quickly, turning down a narrower hallway that led away from the main rooms. Ellie's breath came in short, sharp bursts as adrenaline flooded her veins. She could hear voices now muffled, urgent, unfamiliar, too many of them, overlapping in a language she didn't fully understand. Alejandro stopped abruptly and turned to her. He pressed something into her hand, metal, cold, heavy. Ellie stared down at the gun, her fingers curling around it instinctively even as her mind reeled. "I can't," she began. Alejandro closed her hand around the grip, his fingers warm and steady over hers. The contact was grounding, intimate in a way that startled her more than the weapon itself. "If you need to," he said quietly. Meeting her eyes. "Live." The word hung between them, stripped of romance and illusion. Live. Not fight. Not win. Just survive. Ellie swallowed hard and nodded. They moved again, descending a narrow staircase hidden behind a paneled wall. The sound of gunfire followed, echoing through the stone corridors. Closer now, angrier. Ellie's legs trembled, but Alejandro's presence anchored her, his movements precise and unhesitating. They reached the lower level just as a bullet ricocheted off the wall above them. Alejandro shoved Ellie behind a stone column, his body shielding hers. Another shot rang out, and this time, he flinched. Ellie saw the dark bloom spreading across his shoulder. "No," she gasped. He barely reacted, jaw tightening as he assessed the damage. "It's nothing." Blood seeped between his fingers as he pressed a hand to the wound. Ellie's chest constricted painfully. The man who had seemed untouchable only hours ago was bleeding because of her proximity, because she had chosen to stay. Footsteps thundered nearby. Alejandro leaned close, his voice dropping to a whisper. "When I move, you move." Before she could respond, he pushed off the column and fired, the shot echoing deafeningly in the confined space. Ellie stumbled after him, her heart in her throat as they sprinted down another corridor that led toward a side exit she hadn't known existed. They burst through the door into the open air. The night was alive with chaos. Men moved across the grounds, shadows darting between trees, muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the dark. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy, acrid and suffocating. Ellie's ears rang, her vision tunneling as fear threatened to overwhelm her. A figure emerged from behind a stone wall directly ahead. Ellie reacted before she thought. She raised the gun, hands shaking violently, her finger tightening on the trigger. The sound was deafening. The recoil jolted through her arms, nearly knocking her backward. The man fell. Silence rushed in, thick and unreal. Ellie stared, frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had done that. The realization hit with brutal force, nausea rising sharply. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed if Alejandro hadn't caught her. He held her for a moment longer than necessary, his uninjured arm firm around her waist, steadying her. She could feel his heartbeat through his jacket, fast and strong despite the blood soaking into the fabric. She looked up at him. His eyes met hers, dark and intense, reflecting a storm of emotions she couldn't yet name. Pride, unmistakable and fierce. Burned there, but beneath it lay something raw, almost painful. "You're safe," he said quietly. She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I hurt someone. You saved yourself." Alejandro replied. "And you saved me." More footsteps echoed from behind them. Alejandro released her reluctantly, his hand brushing her arm as if to reassure himself she was still standing. "We have to go." They ran, and they crossed the grounds under fire, weaving through shadows and stone, the night swallowing them whole. Ellie didn't know how long they ran, seconds or minutes blurred together in a haze of fear and adrenaline until they reached a vehicle concealed beneath a canopy of trees. Alejandro opened the door and ushered her inside before collapsing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as they tore away from the villa, leaving smoke and shattered glass behind. Only when the gates disappeared in the rearview mirror did Ellie realize she was shaking uncontrollably. Alejandro glanced at her briefly, then reached over with his good hand, covering hers where it clutched the edge of the seat. His touch was firm, reassuring. "You did well," he said. I didn't want to, she whispered. I know. The road stretched ahead of them, dark and uncertain. Alejandro's breathing grew labored, his face pale beneath the dashboard lights. Ellie's gaze dropped to the blood staining his shirt, panic surging anew. You're hurt, she said. I've been worse, he replied. Though the tension in his jaw betrayed him, Ellie leaned closer, her free hand hovering near his shoulder, unsure where to touch without causing pain. Let me help you, he hesitated, then nodded. She pressed a hand gently against the wound, applying pressure as she had done countless times before in hospital rooms, though never with her heart so painfully involved. Alejandro hissed softly, but didn't pull away. Their eyes met again, closer now, the space between them charged with something dangerous and unspoken. In the glow of passing streetlights, Ellie saw not a man of power, but a man who had placed his life between her and a bullet without hesitation. You could have let me die back there, she said quietly. He shook his head. That was never an option. The admission settled heavily in her chest. As the city lights reappeared on the horizon, Ellie leaned back against the seat. Exhaustion finally breaking through the adrenaline. The gun rested heavy in her lap, a reminder that the world she had stepped into did not allow innocence to survive intact. Behind them, the villa burned with unanswered questions and enemies left alive. Ahead of them lay uncertainty, danger, and a bond forged in fear and fire. Ellie closed her eyes, Alejandro's hand still covering hers, and understood with startling clarity that the night they ran would mark her forever, not just for the violence she had witnessed, but for the man beside her, who had looked at her with pride and pain in equal measure. Whatever came next, there would be no going back. The cabin by the lake was quiet in a way that felt almost unreal. Morning had not yet arrived, but the sky had softened, the black giving way to a muted gray that reflected off the still surface of the water. The world seemed to be holding its breath. No gunfire, no alarms, no engines roaring in pursuit, just the slow creak of wood as the cabin settled, and the distant sound of water touching the shore. Ellie sat at the small table near the window, the locket resting in her palm. She had taken it out hours ago, but only now did she feel steady enough to open it. The metal was warm from her skin, familiar and foreign at once. This object had survived fire, theft, and years of silence. It had waited patiently for her to be ready. Alejandro stood several steps away, near the doorway. His injured shoulder bound tightly, he watched her without intruding. His presence quiet, restrained. He had not asked what she intended to do. He already knew. Ellie pressed her thumb against the seam and felt the faint resistance before the locket clicked open. Inside, there was no photograph. Instead, a thin strip of folded paper, yellowed with age, slid free into her hand. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Her father's. The letters were slightly slanted, the ink faded but deliberate. Each word pressed into the paper with care, as if he had known time would try to erase it. If you are reading this, then I failed to protect you. Ellie's vision blurred. The fire was not an accident. I made choices I believed would keep you safe. I was wrong. Her fingers trembled, but she forced herself to keep reading. Do not trust anyone who claims to be your guardian. Power always demands a price. And the ones who offer protection often do so to ease their own conscience. Her throat tightened painfully. If someone tells you they are keeping you safe, ask yourself what they are protecting themselves from. The final line was written more heavily, as though pressed down by urgency. Do not trust anyone, not even the man who stands between you and the danger. Ellie lowered the paper slowly, her chest aching as though something fragile had cracked open inside her. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to look up. Then she turned. Alejandro met her gaze without flinching. I need to tell you something, he said quietly. She said nothing. The silence between them stretched, thick and fragile, like ice that could break under a single careless word. My father. Alejandro continued, his voice even, stripped of ornament, gave the order to burn that house. The words landed softly. No drama, no attempt to lessen their weight. Ellie's breath hitched. He didn't rush to explain, didn't defend himself. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders squared, as though ready to accept whatever came next. He believed your father had crossed a line. Alejandro said. He believed fear would silence him. He didn't ask whether anyone else would be inside. Ellie felt something hollow open in her chest. You knew, she whispered. Yes. How long since the beginning? The confession did not come with an apology. It didn't come with justification. It came with acceptance. Ellie pushed her chair back and stood abruptly, the movement sharp, unsteady. Her legs carried her only a few steps before giving out. She sank to the floor, drawing her knees up, wrapping her arms around herself as if to keep everything from spilling apart. The cabin felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. She pressed her forehead to her knees, fighting the surge of memories, the smell of smoke, the heat. Her mother's voice calling her name. She had spent years blaming fate, blaming accident, blaming anything that would allow the world to remain random instead of cruel. Now it had a face, and that face belonged to the man who had saved her life. Alejandro did not move toward her. He stayed where he was, the distance between them deliberate, respectful. He didn't reach out, didn't ask her to look at him. He allowed her grief its space, its shape, its anger. I didn't come to you to atone. He said after a long while, I came because someone else would have killed you without hesitation. Ellie laughed weakly, the sound breaking apart almost as soon as it formed. So this is what protection looks like. It looks like truth, Alejandro replied, whether you forgive it or not. She lifted her head just enough to look at him. Her eyes burned. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you weren't safe enough to hear it, he said. And because once I said it, you would have every reason to walk away. And now you still do. The honesty of that answer hurt more than any lie would have. Ellie lowered her gaze again, clutching the locket in her hand. The metal dug into her palm, grounding her in the present. She realized then that Alejandro had never asked her to trust him, not fully. He had only asked her to stay alive long enough to choose. She thought of the night at 2:37 a.m., of the voice on the phone, of the wrong number that had rewritten her life. She thought of the gun in her hands, the moment she had fired without knowing who she would become afterward. I don't know how to look at you, she said quietly. Alejandro's expression softened, just slightly. You don't have to, he replied. Not tonight. The lake outside reflected the dim sky, smooth and unbroken. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cried out, a single, lonely sound that echoed across the water. Ellie remained on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Alejandro stayed standing, silent and present, bearing the weight of a truth that had finally been set free. They did not touch. They did not speak again. And in that quiet, fragile space between them, something fundamental shifted, not toward forgiveness, not toward separation, but toward a deeper, more dangerous understanding. The locket lay open in Ellie's hand, and nothing could be closed again. The lake had gone unnaturally still. Ellie noticed it before anything else, the absence of sound, the way the water no longer lapped against the shore. Even the wind had retreated, leaving the cabin wrapped in a silence that felt intentional. She stood near the window, fingers resting lightly against the glass. Every nerve alert. After everything that had happened, peace no longer felt comforting. It felt staged. Alejandro sensed it too. He rose from the chair where he had been sitting, his movements careful, restrained by the injury that had yet to fully heal. His gaze shifted to the tree line, then to the narrow path leading away from the cabin. We're not alone, he said quietly. The words had barely settled when headlights flared between the trees. Ellie's breath caught. 2 vehicles emerged from the darkness, engines idling low, confident, and they stopped just far enough from the cabin to suggest negotiation rather than assault. Doors opened. Men stepped out, their silhouettes sharp against the glare, weapons visible but not raised. Alejandro moved instinctively, positioning himself between Ellie and the windows. His body language changed, shoulders squared, presence hardening into something lethal. Yet when he spoke, his voice remained calm. "They're not here to shoot," he said. "Not yet." A knock echoed against the cabin door, once, twice, deliberate. Alejandro didn't reach for a gun. He reached for the locket still resting on the table, closed it carefully, and pressed it into Ellie's hand. The gesture was brief, intimate, loaded with unspoken meaning. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "stay behind me." Ellie nodded, though something inside her tightened painfully at the certainty in his tone. Alejandro opened the door. The man standing outside smiled as if they were old friends meeting by chance. He was impeccably dressed, his expression polished, eyes sharp with calculation. "Alejandro Russo," he said warmly, "you've been difficult to reach." Alejandro's gaze didn't waver. "State your business," and the man's smile widened slightly. "Straight to it. I appreciate that." His eyes flicked past Alejandro, landing on Ellie for a fraction of a second too long. "We want the drive." Ellie's pulse spiked. "The hard drive contains information that doesn't belong to you," the man continued smoothly. "But we're willing to negotiate." Alejandro folded his arms. "There's nothing to negotiate." "Oh, I disagree." The man raised a hand, and one of his companions lifted a tablet, its screen lighting up. Ellie sucked in a breath. The image showed her apartment building, captured from across the street. The timestamp was recent. Too recent. "Accidents happen," the man said lightly, "especially to people who live alone." Alejandro's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What do you want?" he asked. The man's smile vanished. Ellie felt the words strike her chest like a blow. A clean exchange. The man continued, "The woman for the drive. She comes with us. You walk away." "No," Alejandro said instantly. The man tilted his head. "Think carefully. You've already lost a villa. You're wounded. Your enemies are multiplying." "Is she worth all of that?" Alejandro didn't look at Ellie when he answered. "Yes." Ellie's heart clenched. The man exhaled slowly, as if disappointed. "Then I suppose we escalate." Alejandro's hand moved. "Wait," Ellie said suddenly. Both men turned toward her, and she stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear roaring in her ears. "You want the drive," she said. "Not me," and the man's gaze sharpened. "You misunderstand. We want leverage." Ellie looked at Alejandro. In that moment, everything crystallized. She saw it clearly now, the pattern she had missed before. Every choice Alejandro made angled toward the same outcome. He absorbed danger, he traded ground, he bled, and if it came to it, he would trade himself, or her freedom. Without hesitation, he would sacrifice anything to end this, including her. "I'll give you what you want," Alejandro said quietly. Ellie turned sharply. "No." He finally looked at her then, his eyes dark, resolute. "This ends tonight." "This ends with you dead," she shot back. His expression softened, almost unbearably so. "Then you'll live." The man watching them smiled, satisfied. A wise decision. Ellie's hands curled into fists. No, not like this. She realized then what she had to do, and the realization hurt more than fear ever had. Alejandro reached into his jacket and pulled out the hard drive. He held it loosely, as if it were nothing more than a bargaining chip rather than the truth capable of collapsing empires. Ellie stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "Trust me," she whispered. He glanced at her, confusion flickering briefly across his face. "This isn't something you fix by being brave." "I know," she said. "I fix it by being smarter." Before he could stop her, Ellie reached out and took the drive from his hand. The men tensed. Ellie turned toward them. "You want this," she said. "You don't need him, and you don't need me. You just need to believe you've won." Alejandro stiffened. Ellie, she didn't look back at him. Her fingers moved quickly, flipping open the casing, sliding out the inner component. Her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She had memorized the weight, the texture, the details during the long nights since the villa burned. She slipped the real drive into her sleeve and dropped the casing onto the floor. "There," she said, holding up what looked identical. "Take it." The man studied her, suspicion flaring. "You expect me to trust you?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "You expect him to die for me? This is cheaper." A tense beat passed. Then the man nodded once. Search her. 2 men stepped forward. Alejandro moved instantly, his hand catching Ellie's wrist. Stop. Ellie finally looked at him. Just for a second. Her eyes were steady, apologetic, determined. I'm sorry, she said softly. I won't let you do this. The men searched her quickly, missing the hidden compartment she had sewn into the lining of her sleeve hours earlier, just in case. When they stepped back, empty-handed, the leader smiled. Smart girl, he said. He took the drive and gestured toward the vehicles. We're done here. They left as quietly as they had come. Engines fading into the distance. Silence that followed was deafening. Alejandro turned to Ellie slowly. What did you do? She exhaled shakily. I lied. His gaze dropped to her sleeve. Understanding dawned. You kept it. Yes. His voice was low, dangerous. You disobeyed me. I saved you. The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Alejandro ran a hand through his hair, the tension finally cracking through his control. You could have been killed, so could you, Ellie shot back, and you would have chosen that without a second thought. He stared at her, speechless. That's what you do, she continued, her voice trembling now. You sacrifice, and you decide alone. You don't give anyone else the chance to choose. Alejandro's jaw clenched. I won't apologize for protecting you. I'm not asking for an apology. She said quietly, I'm asking you to live. The words struck something deep and unguarded. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and the lake remained still, bearing silent witness. Finally, Alejandro stepped closer, not touching, but close enough that Ellie could feel the heat of him, the restrained force he barely kept in check. This was a betrayal, he said. Yes. And you did it anyway. Yes. Her voice didn't waver. Alejandro closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. Something irrevocably changed in their depths. You're more dangerous than I realized. Ellie let out a shaky breath. You taught me. The truth of that settled heavily between them. She had crossed a line, not away from him, but beside him. For the first time, Alejandro understood that protecting Ellie no longer meant deciding for her. And Ellie understood that loving a man like Alejandro meant sometimes standing against him, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. The cabin fell silent again, but this time, the quiet wasn't empty. It was charged with trust broken, rebuilt, and reshaped into something neither of them had ever known how to hold before. The truth did not explode. It unraveled. It surfaced in fragments, documents leaked to the wrong journalists, financial trails suddenly too visible to ignore, names whispered in rooms that had once sworn silence. What had been buried deep inside encrypted drives and locked accounts began to breathe, slowly and inexorably, until the world could no longer pretend it didn't exist. Ellie watched it happen from a distance. She sat in a rented room far from the lake, laptop balanced on her knees, the glow of the screen reflecting in eyes that no longer belonged to the woman who had once answered a phone call at 2:37 a.m. Headlines scrolled past, cautious at first, then bolder, investigations announced, arrests rumored, alliances quietly severed. The empire that had shaped Alejandro's life was not falling in flames. It was dissolving under exposure, and that was far more dangerous. Alejandro moved constantly now. No fixed locations, no predictable routes. Each message he sent was brief, coded, designed to reveal nothing if intercepted. Ellie recognized the restraint behind every word, the effort it took for him not to say more, not to ask her to stay hidden and stay where you are. One message read, "This will be over soon." She stared at the words long after the screen dimmed. This will be over did not mean safety. It meant reckoning. The first attempt on Alejandro's life came 3 days later. Ellie learned about it from a clipped news alert that mentioned a targeted incident near the outskirts of the city. No names, no confirmation. Her chest tightened painfully as she dialed his number, her hand shaking despite her effort to stay calm. He answered on the second ring. I'm fine. He said before she could speak, You were shot. she said. Missed, he corrected. Barely. She closed her eyes, relief crashing through her so hard it left her dizzy. This is because of the evidence. Yes, you said this would end things. It will. Alejandro replied, but not without resistance. Ellie pressed her lips together. I shouldn't have released it all at once. No, he said firmly. You did exactly what needed to be done. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken fear. You should leave the country, he added. Tonight, if possible. The suggestion felt like a knife sliding between her ribs. And I'll handle what's left. She swallowed hard. That's what you always say? And I always do. She didn't argue then. She didn't trust herself to. They ended the call with the same careful restraint that had come to define their conversations, each holding back words that felt too heavy to say through a line that could be severed at any moment. Ellie packed quickly. She chose only what she could carry documents. The locket, the drive now emptied of its secrets. She booked a ticket under a name that wasn't hers. Every movement precise, efficient. This was what survival looked like now, no hesitation, no sentimentality. Yet, when she reached the airport, when the gate number appeared on the screen and reality narrowed to a single choice, her steps slowed. She thought of Alejandro moving through the city like a shadow, hunted by the very world that had once bent to his will. She thought of the way he had stood between her and bullets without question, of the truth he had handed her even when it destroyed him. She thought of the words he had never said aloud. Ellie turned away from the gate. She left the airport without boarding. The message she sent was brief. I'm coming back. His reply came seconds later. Don't. She didn't answer, and the city greeted her with tension coiled tight beneath its surface, sirens in the distance, news vans parked where they didn't belong, faces turned sharp with suspicion. Ellie moved through it all unnoticed, slipping into a safe house Alejandro had once mentioned in passing, one he would never think she would choose. She waited there through the night. The attack came just before dawn. Gunfire shattered the quiet street, sharp and sudden. Ellie pressed herself against the wall as shouts erupted outside. The sound of bodies moving fast and without mercy. She counted heartbeats, breaths, seconds stretching thin, then silence. Footsteps approached the door. Ellie's hand tightened around the weapon she barely remembered taking. The door opened. Alejandro staggered inside, blood darkening his sleeve, his breathing labored but controlled. His eyes snapped to her instantly, shock flaring before hardening into anger. What are you doing here? He demanded. She crossed the room in 3 steps and caught him as his knees buckled, her arm slipping around his waist, her shoulder bracing his weight. Not leaving. This wasn't your fight, he said through clenched teeth. She eased him down onto the couch, her hands already assessing the wound with practiced efficiency. It became mine the moment you decided to die for me. He caught her wrist. You should be on a plane. She met his gaze, unflinching. I'm not being held. The words landed between them, steady and undeniable. I choose. Ellie said quietly. Alejandro stared at her, something raw breaking through the armor he had worn for so long. You don't know what that costs. I do, she replied. I've been paying it since the night you called. He exhaled, a sound caught somewhere between relief and pain. His grip loosened, his head falling back against the cushion. You're impossible. She allowed herself the faintest smile. You taught me that too. Outside. The city stirred as dawn crept in, light spilling reluctantly over streets marked by secrets and consequences. The truth had done what violence never could. It had forced everything into the open, leaving nowhere to hide, and the empire was gone. What remained were people, choices, and the fragile, dangerous space where love and survival intersected. Ellie cleaned the blood from Alejandro's hands, her touch steady, intimate in its care. He watched her quietly, the weight of everything they had lost and everything they had chosen settling into something like acceptance. The world beyond the walls was still hostile, still uncertain, but for the first time since the truth had begun to unravel, Alejandro did not ask Ellie to leave. And Ellie did not need permission to stay. Morning arrived without ceremony. No alarms, no gunfire, no hurried footsteps in the corridor, just light slow and pale spilling through the tall windows of a white room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and quiet hope. The night had loosened its grip, leaving behind exhaustion rather than fear. Alejandro lay still on the narrow bed, his breathing shallow but steady. Tubes traced careful paths across his skin, machines murmuring softly at his side. For the first time since Ellie had known him, there was no tension coiled beneath his posture, no readiness to rise and command the world. He looked human. Ellie sat beside him, her fingers wrapped around his hand. She had been there all night. She knew because her body ached with it, the dull pain behind her eyes, the stiffness in her shoulders, the strange calm that came only after terror had burned itself out. She hadn't slept, she hadn't needed to. When Alejandro's fingers moved, just slightly, she felt it immediately. Her breath caught, his eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the light as if it surprised him. For a moment, confusion flickered across his face, followed by recognition. His gaze found her and stayed there, as though anchoring himself to something real. "You stayed," he murmured. Ellie's grip tightened gently. "You didn't give me much choice." A faint smile touched his lips, fragile and unguarded. It was not the smile of a man who knew how to win. It was the smile of a man who had almost lost everything. "How long?" he asked. "Long enough," she replied. "The doctors say you were lucky." Alejandro exhaled softly. "I've never believed in luck." She studied his face, the lines of exhaustion, the faint bruising, the vulnerability he had never allowed anyone to witness. "Maybe it believes in you," she said. Silence settled between them. Not heavy this time, but full. Ellie watched the light shift across the wall, turning white into something warmer, almost forgiving. Outside, the world continued in ways neither of them could control. Inside, time had narrowed to this. "Ellie," Alejandro said quietly. "Yes, do you regret it?" She didn't pretend not to understand. Her thumb brushed lightly over his knuckles, grounding herself before answering. "No," she said. "I regret the things that happened to us, not the choices we made." He absorbed her words, his gaze searching hers, even knowing everything he asked. "The fire, the blood, the cost?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because I chose." Something in his expression shifted then, the last rigid edge softening. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Alejandro was quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the light that painted the room in promise rather than absolution. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "No," he said. "For the first time, I loved without trying to own." The words were not grand. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of a man who had built his life on control and finally learned what it meant to let go. Ellie leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against his. The contact was tender, deliberate. A silent vow made without witnesses. She closed her eyes, breathing him in, grounding herself in the fact that he was here. "Then stay," she whispered. Alejandro's hand tightened weakly around hers. "I don't know who I am without the war," he admitted. "You'll learn," she said. "So will I, outside." The sun rose fully, light spilling through the windows, touching everything it reached without discrimination. It didn't erase the past. It didn't promise safety. It simply illuminated what remained. There was no perfect ending waiting for them. No return to innocence. No absolution from the lives that had been lost along the way. There were scars visible and hidden that would not fade easily. There would be days when memory pressed too hard, when guilt whispered, when fear resurfaced in unexpected ways. But there was also this. Two people sitting in the aftermath. Hands entwined, choosing presence over escape. Choosing honesty over illusion. Choosing each other without chains, without debt, without ownership. Ellie straightened slowly, still holding his hand. She looked at him not as a protector, not as a threat, not as a man shaped by shadows, but as someone who had survived and was willing to keep living. Alejandro watched her with equal clarity, knowing that whatever came next would not be commanded or controlled. It would be faced, together, the room filled with light, not perfect, just two people who had survived, and that, for now, was enough.